Good morning, everybody. Still morning, yes. Technically still morning. I'm trying to get this video up before we hit noon. So this is week 2, and good work last week getting introductions in there. This week we've got some reading in both of the books, and then we've got a couple little things to work on here. Then next week it's going to really start to get busy. In this course, we have 3 projects. And so starting in week 3, we're going to start the first one. We're just going to kind of steamroll right through still using the process and the process book, but moving much quicker, much faster pace. But because of that, we want to get some of the foundational information from these books going and get you kind of thinking about it, get you back into thinking about how the reading is going to correlate to what you're working on. So both of the books, you may have noticed, have to do with layout. This is single page design. So we're dealing with how we basically break up the space of a page in an interesting way, and not just one that we might think is interesting, but one that actually utilizes grid and measurement and has reasoning behind it. So we're going to learn a little bit about the history of the grid in the first reading here, making and breaking the grid. And a lot of this is going to sound familiar because a lot of it was talked about in 215 in the history of graphic design. So you're going to hear a lot of names in there that are familiar to you, but they're really focusing on how these people and how these different things going on in society and in politics really impacted page layout. So, we've been basically throughout history trying to organize what we're looking at. And especially once the Industrial Revolution started, we had a move into cities, and then there was just more consumerism. With that, design became a part of it, and how we package that design in order to increase consumption of something became important. The older traditions of very ornate, heavily decorated design kind of started to fall by the wayside as designers started to think about how to get a message across in a more clear way. So one of the first people was William Morris with the English Arts and Crafts movement, and his work with trying to design everything and to make not just a page layout, but designing everything from an architectural structure to everything that goes in it. And that might sound familiar, and he definitely influenced people like Frank Lloyd Wright, who in this country did a similar thing, from designing buildings to the glass that went in the windows to the chairs that were in the room to the dishes that were served in that room, designed every single piece of it. So kind of thinking in a broad sense about how all of those parts come together really affected design in general. There's lots of different names in here as you go through it, and things that happened, with the world wars and the art movements that you're already familiar with, like futurism and suprematism. We see that affecting page layout too. And there was some kind of bold design choices made with diagonals and colors and larger letters that really were very, very different. But these were the people at the forefront. Traditional design, commercial design at the time was still, back utilizing the old methods. Then we saw Tishold come along and really start to push for more typographic hierarchy. So a grid structure of the page, but also the use of sans serif type and using that type to create a hierarchy, not just for a visual, but also for understanding. So the words were important in the design as well. We see that just keep going, and we see more designers kind of taking that ball and rolling with it. as we move on in years, we get into the 1960s and we start to see corporate design become important. With the corporations, there was mass production of not only things but of advertisements and all of the different ways of communicating with people within the company, with clients, with consumers. All of that started to become standardized based on the work of a few designers like Bill and Mueller Brockman and Ola Eicher, who started to work with grid systems, and not just grid systems, but design systems to standardize everything and make it easier to understand and start to get into some of that corporate branding. They talk about Vignelli in here and his work with the modular grid, which was very important and is still important. So this chapter really is sort of the history of where the grid began and where it takes us. Then in the layout book, we talk again a little bit about the historical context. They go back a little bit farther, talking about ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, and how really Euclidean geometry is still something that's used for proportional design today. Some of that was very intuitive and obvious. We see, in here they talk about the influence of digital technology, but even in digital technology, we're seeing those same proportions that were developed long ago being utilized today. And it's why we're so good at navigating complex layouts, because we're used to the standard proportions. They talk in here about numbers and proportions and sort of things that are visually pleasing automatically, things that we see in nature that then we try and reflect in design. And then they talk about the golden section, which, there's a geometric basis to it and a way of dividing the page. They show some art examples, but then they also show some page layout designs that utilize it, not necessarily intentionally. Some of this happens not really by chance, but because it's based on very pleasing proportions. So it might happen by chance, rather than intent. Maybe the designer didn't put the golden section on the page, but the proportions that they developed and the layout, the breakdown of the space ended up reflecting that anyway. We see couple different methods of breaking up the space of the page. There's the Van de Graaff canon, where we've got a method to help us break up the space of the page. And anybody can do this. It's a simple method, 8 steps to break up the space into a simple grid. And the proportions are very pleasing. They're also versatile. Then they show us on the next pages 26 and 27 how text and image, when they use the filled in space that's to reflect an image, can be in different places within the grid, but they're still snapped into the grid, very clean and obvious. And that creates some of that balance for us, and it's pleasing to the eye. So, on page 27 here, we see all of these different designs. It's the same exact grid, but each page layout is completely different than the others. So loads of possibilities, loads of variations, but always that consistency. And that's really the goal that they're talking about in here, creating that consistency with variation. There's Villiard's figure that's in here as well, which is based on the Van de Graaff design, but he uses some diagonals to create different measurements. So this one has, a 6x6 grid, a 9x9 grid, a 12x12 grid, and the proportions are still the same regardless of the size. So you'd use whichever works best for the material that you're presenting, how much of it you have to do. Then there's also the Fibonacci numbers. Some of you may be familiar with that anyway. So it's the numerical sequence where the number is always the sum of the 2 preceding numbers, and proportionally it's very pleasing to the eye. So we see some examples in here on how that can be used, some applications on page 32 and 33, where we see how that can be laid out using that grid shape. Then there's preferred numbers. These are the Renard numbers. Again, this is just another kind of preset method of dividing up the space of the page. And he's got 4 options in here, so we can see things divided by those different numbers. More or less space within them, but the proportions are still the same. So much like the other that we're looking at here with Villiard's, we're seeing, basically choosing the system, the R5, the R10, the R20, based on the content that you're going to be using. They talk about special numbers in here too, which we're just talking about kind of terminology of things that you may be familiar with, the rule of thirds or the rule of 3. You've probably heard that, if not in graphic design, maybe in an art class that you've taken. In photography, we tend to think of putting things in 3s, everything in 3s here. It's going to be innately more interesting. It's a way to break up the page a little bit better. They talk about the visual center in here too, and how we can see that in different pictures. And they give a couple of page layout examples as well. Then there's Le Corbusier. And again, we have another method of breaking down the space. And on page 41, we see, the way that this grid can be broken down with, they're just showing image space, but, text could fill up any of the other spaces in there. So again, all of these are examples of ways to break up the page based on, mathematical theories, and then utilize that to create something that's a pleasing design. Now, after you've done the reading on these, you should do 2.1, which is just, any one of these things that you found interesting. Google, find online another source where they discuss one of the topics a little bit more in depth. Just the same amount of information isn't really going to add anything to it for us. So find something where they're discussing it more in depth, or maybe have a different angle on it, maybe more examples of it. Include the link, but then also give us a brief review. And that means you putting it in your own words. Please don't copy and paste. We don't want to read that. So do that. You're going to post that and do peer comments on that after you've done your reading. And then on 2.2, you've got a design to work on. There's an example here. There's a list down here of some things just kind of get you thinking. Use these, use more, use different, use whatever's going to work for you. But the idea is to come up with a manifesto for yourself. And the manifesto is about how you're going to be experimenting with ideas. We've been reading about how other designers have done that in here, how they've been willing to explore and try new things, try something that they haven't used before. So we want to know how you're going to be doing that. This is, clearly just a quick example done by Professor Hankin. Don't copy this, please. You don't ever want to copy. It's why we hesitate sometimes to give examples, but it's here just as that example for you. But don't post it printed. You're not printing this one. You certainly could, but you don't need to, and you don't need to post the printed. Instead, just post the PDF of your design. I'll leave it up to you what the dimensions are for it. There aren't a whole lot of explicit directions for this assignment other than, that one line right up here that you're using some of the ideas there, some of the ideas from the reading to create a manifesto for yourself about how you're going to experiment with ideas. As you do this, keep in mind that you've been reading about the grid and layout. So when you come up with your design, you should be using a grid. You can pick one from here. You can come up with your own. But we should see the effects of that. And in fact, it would be great for you to show us PDFs with the grid showing and without the grid showing. That's going to show us where you're coming from a little bit more, right? it should be interesting visually to look at, not just interesting to read. It should be interesting to read too, because we are going to read it. But keep those things in mind. Everything is designed. It's your manifesto, your design. It should be completely original, and it should be about you and what you want as a goal for yourself. Okay? If you have questions, please ask, but really not a tremendous amount to do this week other than really put some thought into this and explore layout possibilities, explore some grid possibilities, and have some fun working with type in here. We don't just want it typed out. We want something interesting. Be inspired by the people that you've been reading about in here and by some of the plates that are in there. And hopefully maybe by the additional source. Maybe that's giving you some impetus for moving forward with this design. So next week, we're going to be starting our first project, getting the initial questions and the written research in there. So if you're feeling like you've got some extra time this week, go ahead and look ahead to week 3. You can do some of the reading. You can be taking a look at project 1 here and be thinking about that. There's also videos in there. So you may want to be thinking about how you're going to move on to the next project. And hopefully working on the manifesto design will give you some ideas about whether or not the layout that you worked with this week is going to work for the next design series. Okay, if you have questions, let me know. Have a great week.